Would you ask Mr. Martin to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. Martin?
Yes, sir.
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Martin, I'm going to move forward in time to a little bit later in 2016, particularly the May of that year, and your invitation to speak at an NHBC event in the July, which was entitled Facades to Tall Buildings. And you addressed this in your statement at page 50. If we can please go to that, paragraph 143. And you say at 143 at the foot of the page, on 27th May 2016, I received an invitation from Steve Evans of NHBC to speak at a seminar they were organising on facades to tall buildings, focusing on the use of combustible materials and routes to demonstrate compliance. Such events across the regulations are commonplace, and I regularly receive invitations to speak. Where the department can, we try to support them, providing they are putting forward a message with which we agree. Mr. Evans went on to chase my boss, Richard Harrell, at which point I responded, saying I was not happy to attend based on some of the assessments or engineering solutions that were being used. I did not think that it was for me to tell building control bodies what they could or could not do. Discussion followed, during which I accepted that I was happy with the 4 options set out in the 2015 BCA Guidance Note 18, with which I am still happy to this day, but asserted that I felt that some of the assessments and engineered solutions were not as robust as they should be. I'd recently had conversations with some professionals that had expressed this view. Now, just pausing there, if we can, Mr. Martin, what was it about some of the assessments or engineered solutions that were then being used that made you unhappy enough to decide, initially at least, not to attend?
I'm pretty sure it revolved around a conversation I'd had with a building control officer who was concerned that assessments were being accepted without challenge, which again is something that I think reflects the way the building control world had evolved. I'd certainly dealt with assessments when I'd been a building control officer, and they're sometimes a necessary part of the process, but we always felt comfortable to go back to somebody who'd done an assessment and say, are you sure about this? What about, provide some sort of challenge. And I think it was on the basis of that and perhaps another conversation. It was kind of hearsay. It wasn't, I hadn't seen any assessments. Right. I had no reason to see any assessments, but on the basis of some conversations I'd had, I was a little concerned, and to some extent I was trying to use the invitation to the event as a lever to press NHBC on the issue. Right.
What was it about these assessments or engineered solutions that led you to think they weren't as robust as they should be, or at least the conversations with professionals that you'd had about that?
I don't remember anything specific.
Right.
I think it was more that they were being accepted without adequate challenge. Fire safety engineering is a very subjective subject, probably always will be, and you need a degree of challenge in the process so to get to the right answer, and I think that was something I'd become concerned about, and that was part of the reason why I think I wanted to use it as a lever with NHBC to say, are you approaching these things properly or not?
When had you first become concerned by any such reports?
I think it was quite close to this period. I have a very vague recollection of a telephone conversation with a building control officer.
Is that the professional who had expressed that view, or were there others?
It would have been more hearsay and rumour, so there may have been a couple of people, but not a large number of people.
Right.
one or two people, I think.
You say in the brackets there, I had recently had conversations with some professionals that had expressed this view. Which or who were the professionals?
I think they probably were both building control officers.
Both? Were there two?
I don't think I spoke to anyone else. I think it must have been building control officers.
Right.
Generally, those are the people we spoke to the most. I think over time, I think as I said last week, when Shona Dunn took over as head of division, we'd been discouraged from spending too much time with general inquiries because of the way that the team had been resourced. And I think the approach we tended to take was direct designers and engineers to their building control bodies. But if the query's coming from a building control body, then we ought to try and be more supportive. So it tended to be building control people that we spoke to the most.
When you say you spoke to them, what was the occasion on which you spoke to them?
I think it was over telephone. I have a vague recollection of one conversation, and I think I was talking to a building control officer about a different issue, and he mentioned this in passing.
Right.
And so it wasn't a significant body of evidence.
Right. Did they ring you up at your desk or on your mobile? How did these conversations initiate?
I think this was it could have been a telephone call into the department at my desk, or I might have been calling somebody in response to an email.
Right. And was it quite routine that you would have these telephone discussions with BCOs?
Yes.
Right. And they would just, ring you up or send you an email with a problem and ask you to... Yes,
I mean, and in general, most building control officers understood that the department couldn't tell them what to approve and what not to approve. They would very often ask us, one of the things that we did at the department was determinations and appeals. So in some circumstances where there's a disagreement between the building control body and the designer, the applicant, the Secretary of State has a role in determining an argument. And the building control bodies used those, whilst they have no legal status in terms of precedent, in practice most people, they're often published in journals or on the department's website, and it's a way of building control bodies seeing, the approach the Secretary of State takes to a question relates to, the way that they perhaps should as well. And they would often ask us, have we dealt with a case recently that's very similar to the one that they're looking at, when they're trying to decide how to approach a problem. Or it might be that we've been involved in some research or aware of some activity in the industry that they might not be. So they rarely asked us for a direct answer because they understood that we weren't always able to do that, but we could often point them in the direction of more guidance or information.
Had you read any of the particular reports which the professionals you were speaking to about concerned?
No.
Why not? Why didn't you have a look at them and see what the problem was?
I guess it's twofold. One is that I had no authority to check one of these reports, and it would definitely have flown against the advice we had from the department's legal department in terms of not getting directly involved in individual cases. Somebody sent me a report and asked me to comment on it, I'd be in a position where I'm saying whether I thought something was adequate or not, which I was expressly told not to do.
No, but just to understand the nature of the problem, have a look at one of these desktop reports and see what the nature of the problem was. Did you not want to do that?
Well, as I say, if I'd have done that, then I'd have flown in the face of instructions that we'd been given, and ultimately it was for the building control bodies to make those decisions. So, no.
Did you escalate this problem that you'd heard about?
No.
Why is that?
As I say, it's from my point of view, I saw that as another routine debate about building regulations, of which there are many.
Right. Can we go to NHB 401325, please? This is the correspondence that you're referring to in your statement. And if we can scroll down, please, to page 8 of this email run, we can see that at 9:39 in the morning of the 27th of May 2016, Steve Evans sends you an email. Subject, NHBC seminar on facades to tall buildings. Importance high. Hi, Brian. You see that? And he says that NHBC are organising a seminar on the facades to tall buildings, which will focus on the use of combustible materials and routes to demonstrate compliance. 2 sessions. And then in the next paragraph, you can see in red, regulatory requirements relating to the facades of tall buildings, DCLG question mark, 15 minutes. And it appears that that's the invitation for you. And if we go to page 7, we can see various emails where Steve Evans chases Richard Harrell for a response. And Richard Harrell then at the top of the screen gets onto you on the 20th of June 2016. Brian, I'm being chased by Steve Evans on this. Are you happy to speak? And if we go up to page 6, we can see the email sent by you on the 20th of June. At the foot of the screen. Hi, Steve. Sorry for not getting back to you sooner on this. I've been in 2 minds about this. I'm not entirely happy that some of the assessments or engineering solutions that are being used in the industry meet the objectives of Part B. It's not for me to tell building control bodies what they can or can't accept, but I'm reluctant to be seen to be endorsing something that I'm unhappy with. Perhaps I'm worrying unnecessarily, but on balance I think I'll decline your kind offer. And then above that, summarising Mr. Evans's response, he asks for a call so that he can understand what the problem is. And if we then run to page 5, please, at 15:20 on the 21st of June, you can see there, hi Steve, not really near a phone till Tuesday. I'm comfortable with the principles set out in the BCA guidance. Note, the 4 options are a matter of fact. I'm a tad concerned that some assessments and engineered solutions are not as robust as they should be. This is why I'm a bit conflicted. Options 3 and 4 are a matter for designers and BCBs. And then above that, you can see that Steve Evans comes back to you and says, could we talk Thursday? What time would be good? And then he says in the next paragraph, I would be comfortable with you being critical at the seminar in respect of what you would ideally want to see in terms of a robust solution as a pointer for the builders in the room. Are there any NHBC schemes where you feel we may have fell short? I would certainly like to think not, but if you have, I'm keen to understand where you feel we could have done better in terms of a more robust solution. And then if we go to page 4, and your response to that, 23rd of June, looking at the second paragraph, you say this, I should make it clear that I have no specific evidence of a problem on one of your sites. I would tell you. I've just grown concerned that some desktop studies, as they've become known, and engineered approaches I've heard about, make me wonder if the right people are doing them sometimes. I know we've had some communication in the past about problems you've had with the BBA certificate for a Kingspan product. Again, I only have part of the story, so I guess that makes me nervous. Most of my information, quotes unquotes, comes from building inspectors, public and private sector, who are presented with submissions. Many do not appear to cover important details like window reveals. Maybe it would be better if I do come to your event. I've got an appointment on 7th July, but I should be able to move it. Sadly, there's nobody else in the team that could easily cover this subject matter. I'll get back to you. Now, again, what were the desktop studies and engineered approaches you'd heard about? Are they the same thing you've referred to in your statement?
Yes, yeah. As I say, I didn't have a big body of evidence. It was hearsay from a couple of conversations I'd had, with,
right,
which had made me a little uncomfortable.
And where were the projects? Do you remember?
Oh, I wouldn't have known. I mean, people are very cautious to name names. So when you do speak to people, they'll very rarely mention a particular construction project.
Right. And when you use the word information in quotation marks there in the penultimate paragraph, is that because it isn't really information? It's a hearsay.
Yes, that's the point I'm making there. I think
right.
is that I'm not sitting here with a pile of documents demonstrating that things are wrong.
Right.
It's more, as I say, I mean, it's self-evident now that the problem that we had as a policy team is that we had no mechanism to interrogate the system. I guess the system was designed that the architects of the system in the 1984 Building Act were trying to exclude government intervention. That was one of the stated objectives of the Act. And so we didn't really have a mechanism to investigate things. So it would tend to be just hearsay in conversations with people.
How are you able to assure Mr. Evans that the concerns didn't relate to any NHBC site?
Well, I didn't have any evidence of a particular site.
No, but I see. So these two conversations you had with these BCOs, were you clear in your mind, were not NHBC projects?
I didn't know where they were.
Right. Did this information that you had gleaned from building inspectors indicate to you that issue 1 of BCA's Technical Guidance Note 18, option 3, which we looked at last week, which had amended the kinds of people who could do desktops, did you not have a concern that it had been diluted to such an extent that they were now not being done properly?
I don't think I'd registered that was linked to the text in the BCA guidance note. I think fire safety engineering as part of the design of a large building often means that the building isn't following prescribed a set of rules. That's again, the system is designed to allow people to do that, and at various points over the years, governments have encouraged people to use fire safety engineering as a way of increasing efficiency. And again, as I said earlier, my experience is that where you're taking that kind of approach, whether it's an assessment or a fire engineered design or whatever, you need some challenge in the system, and that's what you want the building control body to be doing, is challenging the assumptions that people have used in their designs or the approaches they've taken, so that both sides are satisfied that you've got a robust solution.
But given the very thin spread of information that you've got, in fact, it's not information at all, it's just word on the street, what is it that you were going to be able to tell the attendees at the event? Because you had some proper empirical basis for telling them.
Well, I think I was talking... the section that they wanted me to talk about was explaining the regulations, which is something I would be able to do.
Right. But it looks as if your discovery about the weakness in desktop studies was what had made you change your mind. Is that right?
I think discovery is a strong point. I was concerned. It probably reflected my general concerns in the way the building control world had shifted, in that it was quite common. I'd heard building control bodies saying, well, I approved that because it was signed off by a chartered fire engineer. And that was contrary to what I'd been trained as a building control officer, that you kind of, the qualifications of the person drafting the report was neither here nor there. You needed to satisfy yourself that it was acceptable. So I think that's part of my thinking at this point is I was concerned that building control bodies might be accepting an assessment report without challenge, without really giving it any thought, just saying somebody signed it off, they've got letters after their name, it's fine. And that's, in my view, not what building control bodies should do.
If you look at the foot of the email, you say, sadly, there's nobody else in the team that could easily cover this subject matter. That was correct, was it? At July 2016, there was nobody else in the division who...
Oh, no, there'd not been anybody with any other... I mean, To be fair, I'm a construction generalist with a more an above average experience in fire safety. I'm not fire safety specialist is probably stretching the point with me. I think that's probably a matter of opinion, but there was nobody else in the division that had any fire safety training at all, other than Mr. Harrell was a trained architect, so he would have had some experience of fire protection design, but not to the level that I would have had. And
what about Bob Ledson?
No, he's not got any construction training at all.
Now, we know that you went on to meet Steve Evans and Diane Marshall on the 30th of June 2016. You remember that?
Yes.
Let's look and see what Mr. Evans says about that meeting in his statement. This is at NHB 403020, page 117, paragraph Roman 6. And he says there, at the foot of the screen, my recollection of that meeting was that I explained what NHBC were trying to achieve with the 2016 guidance note. I recall that his response, that's your response, was that this seemed sensible, as that was akin to the deemed to satisfy, quotes unquotes, principle, which is an accepted principle within the building regulations. I also recall confirming arrangements for the Facades for Tall Buildings conference and told him about the other speakers and likely attendees. I cannot recall us discussing his concerns beyond what is set out in the email chain mentioned above. We did not, as far as I can remember, have a wider discussion about combustible materials on buildings over 18 metres or the route to compliance. Now, is it right that you told him that NHBC's aims were, in the document, were akin to the deemed to satisfy principle?
This is the NHBC's guidance note.
It is, and we're going to look at it, and I should have introduced the document to you but before asking the question, but it is. Do you remember saying that NHBC's aims were akin to the deemed to satisfy principle?
In terms of what its effect would be, yes.
What did you mean by that?
So if you go to the older iterations of building regulations, pre-1985, they often had deemed to satisfy provisions where they would specifically describe a form of construction in detail and say somebody building this thing that way with this stuff would comply with the building regulations, and that had that was actually drafted in the statutory instrument, so had sort of direct legal effect. And so you'd have a form of construction that everybody in the industry said, if it meets that, it definitely complies. And that's something that was essentially removed in 1985 and replaced by the functional system with the approved documents. So I think I was just saying, what NHBC doing here was saying, we've got these constructions which we've now reviewed on many occasions and are satisfied that they comply. And NHBC was saying to their clients, if you use these constructions again, we've already checked them, we don't expect you to jump through as many hoops as perhaps you would have done in the past. So I could understand why they were doing that, and it seemed, from their point of view, a sensible approach.
Right, I'm going to come back to that answer in a moment because I want to unpick it a little bit. Before I do, can we look at your statement on this? You say on page 51 in paragraph 145 as follows, 145 at the foot of the screen. I've been shown a PowerPoint presentation prepared by Steve Evans entitled External Facades to Tall Buildings, Routes to Compliance. I cannot definitively state whether he delivered this presentation at the 7th July 2016 NHBC seminar, but I believe he did on behalf of the Building Control Alliance. The presentation set out what, for me, had been the entire point of attending, the slide on the not-so-positives of the BCA experience. This reported that some fire engineers were still basing assessments on opinion rather than fact, and, amongst other issues, that there were no tests using lightweight metal claddings. These were all real issues, and I was happy to see Mr. Evans raising them on behalf of the BCA. I hoped that such a presentation would improve the industry's understanding and provide clarity until the issue could be addressed by way of a review of ADB. Were you already aware, before you went to the seminar, that there were no full-scale tests under BS 8414 on systems incorporating what you describe here as lightweight metal claddings?
I wouldn't have been aware. I mean, I don't regularly see fire tests reports from anyone, or didn't at the time, so I wouldn't have been aware at all.
Right. So this is something that you learned during Mr. Evans's presentation at the seminar, is that right?
I guess so. I mean, his presentation was promoting best practice, as I saw it, so I saw that as a good thing.
In what way did you consider or hope that Mr. Evans's presentation would improve industry's understanding? Understanding of what, specifically?
As I recall, the point that I'm referring to here was NHBC had received assessments which they weren't happy with and had, I assume, rejected because they didn't have the necessary evidence base. And so they were in the seminar saying these are the things that you shouldn't be producing assessments without an adequate evidence base.
Did you consider whether it might be appropriate for you, on behalf of the department, to take on the role of taking steps to improve industry's understanding of the guidance on external fire spread?
Well, I did. I was one of the other speakers, and that's what I was trying to do.
Do you, or did you at the time, consider that that seminar might have been the perfect opportunity to explain to a wider audience than had been present at the CWCT fire group meeting on the 17th of March 2016 that the guidance in 12.7 was poorly written and misleading? Did that occur to you?
Not in those terms. I mean, I was there to try and promote best practice and people understanding the objective of the regulations and how to approach compliance.
Yes, but we don't see anything, and we'll look at what you said shortly, but we don't see anything where you take the opportunity to broadcast to the audience in the room the fact that 12.7 was poorly written, misleadingly titled, and was not intended to refer only to insulation materials, but all parts of the external wall arrangements over 18 metres. Why is that?
I can't remember. I know that you've got a transcript of the day. I can't remember what I said, but I was there as part of a group of people all trying to promote best practice and covering different subject matter.
Right. I mean, did it occur to you that this was the perfect platform, the perfect opportunity, if you couldn't get an FAQ out or some kind of circular or get any traction with anyone in the department, at least to talk to industry on a wider basis and say, look, 12.7 appears to have been misunderstood. Let me tell you what the intention underlying it is, and that is that filler extends at least to the core of a rain screen panel.
I think that was effectively covered by one of the other speakers, I think, when they were talking about the Building Control Alliance guidance note. But by supporting this event, that's what I was trying to do. I mean, I wouldn't have stood up and said the government publication's got mistakes in it. I'm sure I wouldn't have said it in those terms. But getting involved in these seminars was one way of raising awareness of the regulations and promoting best practice.
But why leave it to other speakers? Your government coming along to lend authority to the occasion and to explain the regulations. Why didn't you, and we have the transcript, but why didn't you anywhere in that transcript explain in very simple terms to those assembled what the underlying intention of 12.7 was, and clarify what, for 2 years now, had been crying out to be clarified?
I think I just did my part of the seminar. I was looking at the seminars as a whole and seeing whether it was a positive thing or not.
But you weren't told what to say, though, were you, by Mr. Evans? You had that.
No.
No. So why didn't you take advantage of the liberty given to you by the speaking slot and tell the audience what it was that you now understood 12.7 to mean, and tell them that's how they should understand it, pending eventual revision.
I don't think I was thinking of it in that way.
Why is that?
I think, as I say, I'm thinking about the whole issue of fire safety with facades, not this specific question.
Now, nor do you say anywhere that we can find that ACM with a polyethylene core, and particularly the normal core, the 100% core, should never be used in any external wall build-up of above 18 metres under the linear route. You don't say that either. Take it from me that you didn't. My question is, why didn't you?
I suppose I wasn't thinking that I needed to list all the things that weren't allowed.
Was this not an important and pertinent thing that was not allowed, given the history that had built up over the last 18 months about ACM fires? We've had the torch in Dubai, early 15. We've had the address in Dubai, New Year's Eve 2015. We've had La Crosse fire in November 2014, and we've just had a fire in the UAE at the end of March. All ACM cladding fires with the PE core. The warnings are out there, and it's been covered expressly by the CWCT. What I'd like to understand is, why wasn't that at least on your radar for discussion or mention at this conference?
I was thinking about external wall construction in its broadest sense. I was focused on a range of issues. There are lots of other fires that occurred with other forms of construction, so I wasn't focusing on a single form of construction. I think, again, if you only think about ACM, yes, it's clearly an important point, and I'm not sure if anyone mentioned it on the day, but yeah, I was thinking of the building regulations in its broadest sense and its application to all external wall constructions, not one specific one.
Why would the application of the building regulations in its broadest sense to all external wall constructions be of interest to a group of specialist NHBC building control officers who could be assumed fairly to know that?
It wasn't a building control. The seminar was for designers, and it was a much broader cross section of people in the audience. It wasn't for building control officers.
So all the more reason, if you were going to get to a broad cross section of people, to spell out to them the one thing that you knew needed to be spelt out, which was, well, whatever these mean, you can't use a combustible core in a rain screen panel.
I was thinking about the other issues as well, like cavity barriers and selecting the right insulation and all the other issues that you need to consider.
Now let's go to your presentation. It's at INQ 000014812. And at page 6, you say, if you can go back to page 5, please. You say, back to page 5. I'm sorry, Mr. Martin, this is rather an unwieldy document for some reason, but if we can go back to page 5, I need to start at the start. Yeah, and here, this is the start of your address. And you say, my name is Brian Martin. I'm in the Building Regs and Energy Performance Division of DCLG. That's the small but perfectly formed team that deals with policy on building regulations for England. Then separate teams for Wales and sometimes Scotland and Ireland do essentially the same as us. Amongst other things, I hold the, I think they should say pen, on approved document B, and then it's my fault basically that some things change. Now, just pausing there, I mean, there was obviously an element of lightheartedness about that introduction, understandably, but that revealed a deeper truth, isn't it? That in fact you were in charge of approved document B, at least.
Well, there wasn't anyone else, so it must have been me. Yes.
Yeah. Now, let's then move then to page 7. And you've got a presentation, and just below halfway down, looking at the pictures on the right-hand side, you say, the one we've all seen a lot of, various incidents, again in Dubai, they've had a bit of a bad time of it recently with cladding fires. In a way, it's been an opportunity for us all to learn about cladding fires and what not to do, if you like. We've had our own in the past as well. Garnet Court in Glasgow back in 1999, when I was a wet behind the ears fire investigator working for BRE at the time. Now, it's clear from that the Dubai fires, the ACM polyethylene cord fires, were not only on your radar, you actually made a virtue of mentioning them at the conference, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And what were you saying? What was the point of mentioning them?
I think I was just highlighting what external fire spread looks like.
Yes. And then go to page 8, final paragraph on that page. Cladding fires generally. You see that?
Yep.
You say, cladding fires generally. If you look at a lot of cladding fires, certainly the ones in Dubai, and some of the other ones we've experienced over the years, they tend not to kill people. So why are we even worried about these things? That's probably because we've been very lucky. Just pausing there and going back to the show me the bodies discussion that we had this morning and the evidence that we looked at earlier, that rather indicates that the absence of fatalities was what was driving the department's attention or lack of attention on cladding fires. Would that be fair?
I think I'm sort of presenting this rhetorically. I'm presenting the question that I'm then going to answer. So I'm saying, it is the vast majority of the international cladding fires that we'd seen had resulted. The buildings had been evacuated without difficulty, and because the fires on the outside of the building and the escape routes tend to be away from the outside of the building, and I'm trying to explain to the audience why we should still take the issue seriously.
Yes, and we've come on to see that. That you say that's probably because we've been lucky. Very often you can say that we're lucky in that if we've got an otherwise well-designed building and we get a cladding fire, there's a good chance most people will be able to evacuate the building. Certainly moving away from the cladding, going downstairs and leaving the building. Just pausing there, was it your understanding in July 2016 that fire and rescue services would advise evacuation in the first instance in the case of a fire in a clad high-rise building, or rather a cladding fire?
For a stay-put type building you're speaking about, I'm guessing.
You are guessing correctly.
I would have expected the fire service to see a cladding fire. If a cladding fire was developing quickly, I'd expect them to recognise that there's a potential that the stay put would no longer be appropriate and for them to evacuate the building. I'm not saying you wouldn't design with that intention, but my expectation would be that's what firefighters would do when faced with a building where there was clearly fire spread across the building.
Well, what was that expectation based on?
Combination of my experience and conversations I'd had with firefighters over the years. And when's this, 2016? And the conversations we'd had following the Leckernell House fire. I thought that was that, as far as I was concerned, that was a well understood principle. That the stay put. It's a complex issue. I know the stay put approach is in general certainly was at that time and still is at the moment considered to be the best strategy for a block of flats. But where firefighters can see that fire is spreading in a way which would mean that stay put is not going to work or it's not going to be safe for the residents, then you'd initiate an evacuation.
Where is that reflected anywhere in approved document B?
It's not, because it's not a guidance document for firefighters, it's a building design document.
Where is anything in approved document B consistent with the idea that if you have a cladding fire and stay put has to be revoked, then the fire and rescue services will be able to do so?
I don't think the way ADB had been drafted up to that point had been to focus on the design issues without providing a narrative to explain stay put. And I think that's something which I know when I was working with BSI on BS 9991, we talked about trying to provide a narrative along those lines. I think I nearly drafted one, and then I think that got rejected in the end. I can't remember why, but possibly because the fire service were concerned. They didn't want designers to presume that there was the fire brigade had another option up their sleeve, so to speak.
Well, can we agree on this, that a stay put or defend in place strategy was effectively enshrined into the building regulations so far as concerned a building over 18 metres in reliance upon compartmentation? That was a basic design.
Yes, and had been since I think probably the sort of 1960s or something.
Yes,
yeah.
And that nothing in approved document B catered for the contingency that stay put might have to be revoked or abandoned and a full-scale evacuation or rescue ensue.
No, that was always regarded as being an operational issue.
Was it your view in 2016 when you spoke these words that a stay-put strategy was inherently incompatible with buildings which had been clad in combustible materials?
I think you've leapt several steps forward. I mean, it's incompatible with extensive external fire spread. You could clad a building in combustible materials and still avoid extensive fire spread. That's essentially the point of BS 8414, was to try and deliver a building that would do that. But yes, if you've got extensive external fire spread, then I'd expect the building to be evacuated as quickly as possible.
Yes. And when did you first form the conclusion that if you have extensive external fire spread, because the building has been clad in combustible materials which have not passed the BR 135 criteria, then a full-scale or substantial partial evacuation would have to ensue?
I don't think I thought of it in terms of the BR 135 criteria. I think I had a general understanding of the stay put principle all the time I'd been working with building regulations. I think during after the Lecklenor House fire, as you might imagine, there's some discussion about the stay put approach, and the conversations I'd had with senior and for that matter junior firefighters was that there was an understanding that where a fire was spreading further than you would expect in a block of flats, i.e. beyond the flat of origin, then evacuation was something that the commander would be on scene would be considering. It's a really difficult decision to make, at which point you should decide to do that. But I'd certainly met firefighters that had done it.
Did anybody ask you for your views on the draft of GRA 3.2, which was in the process of being revised in the summer of 2013 and eventually got published in February 2014?
I don't know if I ever saw the draft. I remember talking about it to people. I mean, because it was an operational issue, it was kept to some extent separate from us. But I think we would have spoken about it. I recall talking about it.
Who did you have a conversation with about it? Do you remember?
I can't remember, I'm sorry.
Was it Les Britzman? Does that name ring a bell?
I remember the name, but I probably spoke to Les about a range of things, so I couldn't be
Right.
sure.
And it goes on. You say that's probably because we've been very lucky, and I've read that to you. And if we turn the page to page 9, you say, certainly moving away from the cladding, going downstairs and leaving the building, that doesn't mean to say you've had a good. That means aren't we lucky that we designed the rest of the building properly? It's not a good way to rely on things. Fire safety, like all safety measures, is about having layers of safety. Every time you lose a layer of safety, you significantly increase the risk of something might go wrong. In the case of the fire in Azerbaijan last year, 15 people were killed as a result of a cladding fire. The product substitution at some point during that project, what they clad the building with was an entirely inappropriate material. And it goes on like that. Again, did it occur to you at the time that the use of combustible cladding materials in external wall build-ups, as a result of people misunderstanding 12.7, presented a risk that might very well not be mitigated by the stay put policy in the case of a building which wasn't as well designed as the Dubai buildings?
And you've put it in a very specific way.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I can answer that question. I understood that external fire spread was one of the risk factors that you needed to address when you were designing a building, and if you didn't, you put the occupants at risk.
Yes. So does it mean that you understood at the time that if you're going to have combustible cladding, then in order for the stay put assumption, the stay put design assumption to hold good, you had to have a lot of other, or a number of other reliable redundancies, layers of fire protection?
I suppose so. You're using the phrase combustible cladding, which
Well, all right.
I'm trying not to be pedantic, but you have a tendency to return to something I've agreed with, so I need to take care with the language you're using. It's if you've got a cladding system which is going to present a risk of fire spread, then you shouldn't do that, is the simple answer. But if you've got a fire like that, then you become reliant on those other measures.
Let's go to paragraph 146 of your statement. You say there, page 52, at the 7th July 2016 seminar, the NHBC launched a document entitled Acceptability of Common Wall Constructions containing combustible materials in high-rise buildings. And then you go on. This document provided specific guidance on option 3 of the 2015 BCA Guidance Note 18 as to how to achieve compliance with requirement B4. The document provided at Appendix 3 has a section on ACM panels. The guidance section provided that NHBC would accept that a certain makeup of a facade would meet requirement B4, and it then went on to set out what a specification would be from inside to out. Having reviewed the document, I was satisfied that this was a reasonable approach to satisfying the functional requirements of the regulations. I was happy to see the NHBC warning that substitution with a less fire-resistant product did not take place on site. Now, when did you first read NHBC's 2016 guidance note?
I think it was in advance, the meeting I had with NHBC in advance of the seminar.
Right, so the 30th of June 2016 with Steve Evans and Diane Marshall.
I believe so, yeah.
Right. Who did you understand that the guidance note was intended for? Who was the intended audience?
I think that was for NHBC's building control clients.
Right. Let's go to it. NHB 6065. And can you just confirm for us that that is the document you're referring to?
Yes.
Yes. Now, it's entitled Acceptability of Common Wall Constructions Containing Combustible Materials in High-Rise Buildings. And if we stay on page 1 and look to the right-hand column of the text, towards the bottom of page 1, under the heading Common Wall and Facade Types Accepted by NHBC, it says this: the following common wall and facade constructions are acceptable to NHBC without the need to provide an option 3 assessment, providing that the design specification and installation meets the minimum specifications set out in the following appendices. And then you can see that there are 3 appendices: 1, brickwork facade; 2, timber panelling; and 3, aluminium composite panels. Now, do you remember, I mean, in simple terms, and we'll look at the note in detail, but in simple terms, it significantly widens the routes to compliance for the use of certain combustible materials over 18 metres.
I'm not sure if it does widen the route to compliance. What they were trying to do is to say that these are constructions that they have already reviewed and concluded that they meet one of those routes to compliance.
Right. Well, let me put it differently. Do you agree that it was creating an alternative to producing a desktop, which was itself an alternative to using either materials of limited combustibility above 18 metres or passing a full-scale test under BS 8414?
Yes.
Yes. Let's look at Appendix 3 then, page 4. And under the heading Key Issues, if you look at the left-hand side, it says this. It says, similar to cement-based panels, mineral cord aluminium composite panels tend to crack and break up under sudden flame impingement, etc. And then if you look at the next paragraph, it refers to BR 135. And then the next paragraph says, the end of that second paragraph, it says, with the measures below, it is considered that an aluminium composite panel facade finish will meet these criteria. And those are the criteria in BR 135. Then it goes on to say, with the measures below, etc. And then it goes on to say, these appropriate measures include the use of minimum class B in accordance with BSEN 135011, aluminium composite panels which provide a class 0 surface spread of flame, and then the use of a cement particle board behind the insulation, minimum class B, etc., and then the use of reputable and robust cavity barriers, etc. And then it says restrictions on use. The use of polythene or polythene mineral cord aluminium composite panels which do not achieve a minimum class B combustibility classification fall outside the scope of this guidance note. Now, reading the words polythene there for polyethylene.
Mr. Bennett, I wonder if we could scroll down a bit, because I've only got the first 2 lines on my screen. And
I'm
so
sorry.
sorry.
Sir.
You're quite right.
Thank you. Sorry, now put your question again if you'd like to.
Making allowances for the words polythene there, which should be read as polyethylene, how did you understand that paragraph when you read it?
I remember this being explained to me in that NHBC specifically wanted Euro Class B as a minimum performance, as opposed to Class B or Class O.
It allows, doesn't it, or did you understand it as allowing for the use of polyethylene cord ACM so long as those panels achieve Euro Class B? Or better?
Yeah, as I understood it, this was based on the information that NHBC had received over an extensive number of projects. So I presumed, I think wrongly now, that there had been some testing to demonstrate that.
I just want to get your evidence about how you read this. Did you read it as allowing for the use of polyethylene cord aluminium composite panels as long as those panels achieved Euro Class B?
Yes.
Yes. So not, therefore, as saying that ACM panels with a polyethylene core are not permitted.
I think my understanding at the time is that the only Class B products were ones that had some sort of fire retardant material inside them.
But that's an understanding about what was out there and available, yes? That's not a...
I didn't have a great deal of understanding what was out there and available, but NHBC had dealt with an extensive number of projects where they'd received a lot of information from the various engineers that were supporting the applications, and NHBC was satisfied that a panel that met this specification would achieve the criteria in BR135.
Did you read anything on this page as saying that an ACM panel with a polyethylene core was effectively banned?
I think I looked at it in those terms. I looked at it. I saw that. I remember I can't remember who it was at NHBC. I spoke to. It might have been John Lewis, the fire engineer, and he said that it was important that it was Euro Class B and not Class O, as the Class B separated out the poorer performing ACMs. So that was my understanding of how this worked, which seemed reasonable to me.
Class B is not limited combustibility, though, is it?
No, but as I say, this was based on, as I understood it, a lot of large-scale testing, because otherwise how would they have reviewed all of these buildings?
Did they tell you that?
I don't think they directly did. I think what they explained to me is that they dealt with a lot of projects, that they'd been reviewing them, and they'd been dealing with lots of projects with a wide range of different forms of construction, and there were certain forms of construction that had become more common, and they were satisfied with the evidence that they'd been presented that these particular constructions met the performance criteria in BR135. So I guess I presumed that meant that at least some testing was involved. I now understand I don't think there was any testing on ACMs, certainly not to BS8414, but at the time I think I presumed that there had been. I didn't see how else you could do an assessment or a desktop, as it's become known, for a construction involving a rain screen panel if no one had ever tested one.
Did you, just to be clear about your evidence just now, when you were shown this and discussed it with Diane Marshall and Steve Evans, did you just assume that there had been full-scale tests under BS8414 which had passed the BR135 criteria, where an aluminium composite material panel with a polyethylene core had been used as part of the system?
Where that panel was Class B, yes, that's what I was presuming from this, is that they'd seen sufficient evidence to be able to confidently say, because that's what they were doing, was that a Class B ACM panel would meet those criteria. So I assumed that was satisfactory.
Had you forgotten CC 1924 and the results of the tests in 2001, particularly with the ACM panel with the PE core that had to be terminated before 5 minutes was up, with flames going up 20 metres?
As I mentioned to you when you asked me about that before, I wasn't aware of the full extent of that failure, and I presumed that this was a different material.
Why?
Because it's Class B and they've reviewed hundreds of buildings and come to the conclusion it met the BR135 criteria, which, if I had have been that aware of that test all those years before, then I would have recognised that wouldn't have been likely to be true. But I only had scant knowledge of that test, as I've told you before.
You have. If we turn to the right-hand side, please, in the last bullet point above the word, the use of reputable, you see that? It says minimum Class B when assessed to BS EN 13501, aluminium composite material boards with a Class 0 surface spread of flame classification. Now again, it's right, isn't it? Class B would not, under approved document B, count as material of limited combustibility, would it?
That's correct.
No. Is that specification there in two places, and particularly here, using a minimum Class B ACM board, not wholly inconsistent with the requirement for all elements of the build-up, including external facings, to be material of limited combustibility?
It is, as far as I was aware. They were basing this on a series of projects they'd dealt with where they'd satisfied themselves that it met the performance criteria in BR 135.
But I think the answer to my question, the first part of your answer, is yes.
Yes.
Yes. And we can also see, if we scroll down a little bit, what the rest of this list says. Just above it, it says, we can scroll up. Insulation, maximum 140 millimetres thick, comprising one of Kingspan K15, Celotex RS 5000, Extratherm SRRS. Now, those are all combustible insulation materials, aren't they?
Yes.
Not materials of limited combustibility.
Correct.
So this guidance was blessing the use above 18 metres of two important elements of a cladding system, both of which were regulated by ADB, that were not materials of limited combustibility. Yes?
Absolutely, yes.
But without any testing of those elements.
The way it was explained to me is that these forms of construction that set out in this guidance note were ones that NHBC had reviewed in detail on many occasions and had satisfied themselves that they met the performance criteria of BR 135. And on that basis, they would be acceptable in terms of requirement B4. I was under the... I don't see how you could possibly have done that without some large-scale testing.
How is the blessing of combustible insulation above 18 metres, either alone, but particularly when combined with a cladding panel with a polyethylene core of minimum Class B, consistent with the linear route to compliance?
It's not.
No. And indeed, do you accept that if this guidance note was acceptable, at least so far as these materials were concerned, you wouldn't need to amend or review ADB?
I think there were still quite specific limits here, and as I say, I was under the impression that this was based on perhaps more detailed consideration than perhaps the evidence you've now seen shows. But I can see the point you're making is it showed that this type of insulation and that type of cladding, they were very confident that within the constraints that they set out, they would meet the performance criteria of BR 135. And
Yeah.
so that seemed that was like a good thing.
Now, scrolling down, if we can again, so you've got the whole thing. Can we start at the foot of page 4 with the bullet points? I'll come back to the paragraph above it in a moment, but it says the following precautions are incorporated into the specification, design and installation. And then from inside to out, this is what I want to focus on in this question, a double layer of 12.5 millimetre plasterboard, minimum 100 millimetres lightweight steel frame internal leaf, combustible or non-combustible insulation, and then no less than 12 millimetres thick cement particle board of minimum combustibility Class B, and then insulation, which I've read to you, drained and ventilated cavity, aluminium support rails, and then again, minimum Class B aluminium composite material boards with a Class 0 surface spread of flame classification, and then cavity barriers, and then some other things underneath that, which you can see.
Yeah.
Looking at it, do you agree that it's no more than a list of products and dimensions?
It is a list of products and dimensions, I guess, yes.
So do you agree that any BCO, Building Control Officer, could quite fairly pick up this document and approve a cladding system on a high-rise building, anywhere, any high-rise building, that contained a Class B 100% polyethylene cord ACM panel and RS5000 or K15 as the insulation behind it.
Well, this is an NHBC policy document, so any NHBC building control officer is essentially getting an instruction from NHBC that it's telling everybody that NHBC will accept that form of construction. Yes.
Yeah. So, and on BBA paper, at least, and leave aside the problems with the certificate for the moment, that's what was on Grenfell Tower, wasn't it? Kingspan K15, Celotex RS5000, and apparently a Class B aluminium composite panel with a Class 0 surface spread of flame classification, or one which could be regarded as such.
I don't know the exact specification of the construction on Grenfell Tower, but as I say, as far as I was aware, this had been subject to a lot of scrutiny by NHBC and had been evidenced as meeting the performance criteria of BR135. I understand now that that's not entirely accurate, but that's not what I'd been led to believe.
Did you understand at the time? I mean, I should just tell you there's an irony here, of course, because the 7th of July 2016 was the very day when RBKC's John Hoban signed off the Certificate of Practical Completion on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. But it would have been possible for him, if he had been, let's assume he'd done the work, to have discovered this document, looked at it, done an investigation of what was on Grenfell Tower, and seen that the very products listed as acceptable here as meeting requirement B4 were on his building, and gone ahead and signed that practical completion certificate. Yes?
I guess so, yes.
Yes. Now, this guidance note essentially delivers the builder and the building control officer a linear approach to compliance, which doesn't require any of the external elements to be materials of limited combustibility, and doesn't require the insulation to be of limited combustibility either.
Yes, I mean, it's quite specific about the particular insulation materials, and they are the better performing insulation materials that are on the market in terms of fire performance. And I'm sorry to repeat myself, but my understanding is that this had been assessed thoroughly by NHBC.
Before you lent your approval to this document, even informally, did you not want to see from NHBC at least the test data from the tests incorporating any of these materials or products, and understand from NHBC how the extrapolation had been made to the desktop which supported their use in different tests, different structures, and on top of that, the basis on which it was thought safe to apply it across the board?
Well, it wasn't for me to check the detail. What the conversation I'd had with NHBC was about, are they happy that the assessments that they're looking at are appropriate, and are they checking assessments thoroughly? And I was reassured that they were taking a responsible attitude to looking at assessments, and that was part of the reason for their seminar, was to make sure that people were submitting adequate submissions to them, and they said that they'd had a lot of assessments, which and they'd already assured me that those assessments were based on test data. So they said these are particular constructions that they'd seen a lot of, and that they were satisfied met the performance criteria. So that seemed an entirely reasonable approach for them to take.
Did you not remember the words in the 2013 edition of BR135 in both Annexes A and B to the effect that the results of a test, full system test under BS 8414, could not be transliterated to a different system? Did you not remember that?
You're mixing terms here. What BR135 is talking about is the fact you can't claim a classification to BR135 for a construction that isn't the one you tested, which is true. But as I think several people have said, including myself, it's a reasonable approach if you have sufficient data from large-scale tests to interpolate between them, and that's where assessments are appropriately used and regularly used across the industry for a wide range of different things. So I saw this as being reasonable. They'd seen a range of assessments on a large number of buildings, and they were going through the same process repeatedly, and concluded that there were certain constructions where they were so confident they'd seen enough data that they could come up with this deemed to satisfy type approach.
Well, just tell me with this. Did it not strike you as very odd that they were accepting constructions which simply would not begin to comply with the linear route under ADB?
No, sir, because that was the whole point of BS 8414, was to provide an alternative to the linear approach to ADB.
See, these weren't based on a lot of 8414 tests. They were based on previous assessments, which were themselves said to have been based on 8414 tests, which you and possibly nobody else had seen. Did it not raise some sort of warning flag?
If I'd realised the lack of testing involved, sir, yes, it would have done. But I was under the impression that quite a lot of testing had been done in support of those assessments, which the BCA guidance note is quite clear, and the process of assessment, you can't interpolate between two tests if you haven't done the two tests, but that appears to be what has happened in some of these cases.
But this all depends, doesn't it, on the quality of the assessments that they were themselves extrapolating from in order to produce this
Yes, sir.
Document.
And those assessments, as I understood it, were carried out by organisations with the right sort of experience, and they'd been reviewed carefully by NHBC's fire engineers.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
You referred to Mr. Chairman, I've got 5 minutes left on this topic, if I may. You referred to the deemed to satisfy in your last answer and also in your statement, but you explained to us very helpfully this afternoon that the deemed to satisfy concept was one which had been removed by the 1984 Building Act and the 1985 Building Regulations. How come it could be relevant now?
In the case of NHBC, it's a very large approved inspector that does a lot of work on very similar buildings, so it comes across the same question frequently, and it's something government encourages building control bodies to do, is to be consistent in its assessment of applications. That's something which is in the Enforcement Concord and I think it's the Regulators Code, but government policy on two enforcers, which NHBC effectively is to be more consistent. So I saw this as them trying to be more consistent on forms of construction that they were dealing with regularly. So it sat well with government policy.
Now, there's a further point. If we can scroll down, please, to the guidance at the bottom left-hand corner. I read some of this to you, but not all of it. And it precedes the bullet point list of products and specifications. And it says this: where a building has a floor level exceeding 18 metres from outside ground level, a Class B aluminium composite panel finish is specified, and the builder can demonstrate that the following precautions are incorporated into the specification, design and installation of the facade. NHBC will accept the build-up as meeting requirement B4(1). Did you read that paragraph?
Probably.
Yeah. Did you not ask Steve Evans or Diane Marshall on what basis they would accept these build-ups as meeting the functional requirement? Not just satisfying the guidance, but actually meeting the functional requirement.
Well, they were working on, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but they were working on the basis that they were satisfied by the evidence they had seen that this form of construction met the performance criteria in BR135, and therefore demonstrably didn't contribute to external fire spread.
Oh, now, that's that last part of that answer that I'm interested in. You say met the performance criteria in 135 and therefore demonstrably didn't contribute to external fire spread. It's the therefore. Did you think that if you followed ADB, whether through the linear route or the full-scale test method, and had got a BR 135 pass under the alternative method, you therefore met the functional requirement without more?
Ultimately, there's always the duty to think broadly. So you'd have things like the mechanical performance report from BR 135. So again, if you were doing an assessment, you would want to look at the mechanical performance in case there was something untoward there that you were concerned about.
What about
I can't think what that would be, but that's something that an engineer doing that sort of work would want to do.
And where do we see in this document anything that says that you should consider the use of Kingspan K15 or Celotex RS5000 or an aluminium composite material board with a polyethylene core, having regard to the height, use and position of the building?
I think it's broadly the whole document is trying to do that, isn't it?
No. Well, it's trying to do that. But where do we see it? The reason I'm putting this to you is because, as it says, NHBC will accept the build-up as meeting requirement B4. Did it occur to you at the time that NHBC had leapt from meeting the approved document B guidance, the statutory guidance, to satisfying the functional requirement, without pausing to think whether satisfying the guidance did meet the requirement in every case?
I think they dealt with fairly. There was a lot of repetition in the kind of work that they dealt with. So I think I don't think I considered that in detail at the time. But there's a lot of repetition in the type of work they were doing, and my experience of them is they were like quite competent as a building control body, because it was a large organisation and they had access to people like Mr. Lewis. They had fire engineers in this, and most local authorities didn't have access to a chartered fire engineer.
Mr. Martin, it's more fundamental than that. It's more fundamental than that. Did you not read this as telling NHBC BCAs that they no longer needed to worry about the height, use and position of the given building above 18 metres, provided this list of materials and dimensions was used?
I think this is saying that NHBC had thought about those issues and concluded this form of construction was acceptable.
On every single building above 18 metres, regardless of its height, use and position? Is that what you thought?
Well, the height is above 18 metres, it says it there, and the use of the building, NHBC mostly do domestic premises, it's the nature of their business. I don't know if it says blocks of flats anywhere on this guidance note. And its position is more relevant to fire spread between buildings and not external fire spread.
Do you not accept that this was a thoroughly dangerous and irresponsible document because it signalled to a large population of building control officers operating under the NHBC banner that they could tick off a cladding system comprised entirely of combustible material and, what is more, do so on the assumption, without more, that it adequately resisted the spread of fire over the walls?
At the time, I saw this as being a reasonable approach to dealing with a form of construction that they had dealt with on numerous buildings, and they had satisfied themselves, looking at the information they'd been given, that it met the requirement.
You knew that no lightweight cladding panels had actually been tested to be S8414. You told us that Mr. Evans confirmed that in his own presentation. You did.
I don't remember making the connection at the time. I wish I had.
On what possible basis could it be appropriate for the NHBC to accept such panels for use over 18 metres without any full-scale test data to support their use?
I don't think they should have done, and I don't think anyone should have been doing an assessment without at least some full-scale testing of the cladding panel involved.
Right.
I still find it hard to believe that anyone doing an assessment would have been willing to do that.
Right. You see, you told Mr. Jenkins on the 17th of February 2016 that you weren't sure that even ACM products with a flame retardant core would meet the rule of thumb in the approved document, and doubted whether or not they would get through an 8414 test. And yet here we are 6 months later, you endorsing the use of such products over 18 metres without full-scale
So I
testing.
was now under the impression that someone had tested them
Well, just on the basis of this document.
on the basis of what NHBC told me when they were planning to present this document
But
at the
let's be
seminar.
clear. Did they tell you that there were recent tests with ACM with the PE core that had met the BR135 criteria?
Probably not as directly as that,
Right.
and in hindsight, I wish I'd challenged them on that.
Right.
But they talked about the fact they'd reviewed a lot of buildings. They talked about the approach they were taking to cladding, which seemed a responsible one, and because they dealt with a lot of projects with very similar forms of construction, they were satisfied that this form of construction met the functional requirement. And I think I must have assumed that the only way you could have done that is with some sort of large-scale test. I don't see how you could possibly do that without doing some sort of large-scale test. At least one. I was, when I discovered that all these assessments had been done without that kind of what I would regard as a minimum level of relevant data, I was shocked. I still am.
Did you mention this note or your endorsement of it as a reasonable approach to Melanie Dawes' office when summarising the guidance for her in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire, when you said that aluminium PE was effectively banned?
I can't remember. I don't think I did.
No. Why not?
It was a very intense period, and when you're briefing a permanent secretary, you tend to answer the questions they ask you, it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. And I think I don't know if it slipped my mind or I just didn't manage to get all my words in, I don't know, but I don't think I mentioned this.
In truth, it can't be correct, can it, that ACM PE was effectively banned? This document effectively permitted it.
I think I presumed that it was an ACMPE.
Mr. Chairman, I've gone on a little bit longer. I apologise to both of you.
Well,
and the
there we
witness,
are.
but
We
this is a
ought to
convenient
have
moment.
we ought to have a break at this stage. So we'll take a break now, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Martin. We'll come back, please, at 4:45. And once again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence. All right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 4:45, please. Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Martin to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Martin, ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Martin, I'm going to change now to a completely different topic, which is the LGA guide on purpose-built blocks of flats, which is in the context of the RRO, in other words, the Fire Safety Regulatory Reform Order 2005. Now, nowhere in your statement do you refer to having any responsibility for policy matters relating to the RRO. Is that because you didn't?
Not directly, no. There are various points where I assisted colleagues that were working on policy relating to the fire safety order.
Right. And in what capacity were you assisting those colleagues?
At times, I was the only person in the department, or sometimes both departments, that had any experience of fire safety. And I had a network of contacts, which meant that I could help sometimes.
Right.
And both teams were quite small, so sharing information was something that we tried to do when we could.
And did you have any involvement in policy matters relating to the RRO on a daily basis?
Not. It wasn't my principal function, but I think at one stage, I think it was in my objectives. Every year, you review your objectives as an official, and I think there was a period where that included recognition that I would assist colleagues that were dealing with the fire safety order, probably while they were still in the department, I think.
Now, you told us in your statement, paragraph 10, that before the Grenfell Tower fire, you'd reported to Anthony Bird and then Richard Harrell.
Yes.
As head of technical policy. Did you have any formal reporting lines in relation to the RRO?
No.
Right. Now, I'm going to turn to the LGA guide itself, which I think you may remember was published in the July of 2011.
Yes.
Yes. Can we go to your statement, please, at page 55? And you say there, at paragraph 156, in answer to the question, what other work was identified in the period 2009 to 14th June 2017 to improve fire safety in high-rise purpose-built blocks of flats? During the period in question, work on fire safety in purpose-built flats was aimed at ensuring that there was adequate guidance for the safe management of buildings in use. Whilst this is outside my direct area of responsibility, I did assist colleagues working in that area and the LGA by helping with the procurement of a contractor to produce the guidance which I've referred to above, and then providing contributions and comments as the document was developed. The LGA guide was reviewed following the coroner's recommendations in the Lacknell House inquest, but was found to be suitable without amendment. Why were you involved in the drafting of the LGA guide if it was outside your direct area of responsibility?
One of the things that we tried to do between the two policy teams was to make sure that any guidance that existed didn't conflict. And so, as a minimum, I was reviewing that. What you wouldn't want is a provision in the guidance for existing buildings which required something which was in conflict with the standards you were setting for new buildings, because that would be unworkable. So that was probably the main reason for being involved. But generally, I would be reviewing it to see if I could make any helpful comments.
What did you know about the RRO that meant that you could add value to that project?
I've been involved in various aspects so I'm trying to think now. So I'm just trying to get the chronology straight in my head. BRE had a contract with the department to produce some of the fire safety order guidance at the same time as we were working on the 2006 edition of Approved Document B. And so I was involved to some degree. I wasn't in the team that was doing that work because I was already tied up with the approved document, but I was involved at that stage. And it was quite an important piece of legislation for fire safety, the fire safety order, so it's something I guess we were all talking about. There was a period whilst I was still working for it was probably the last couple of years while I was still working for BRE, where in addition to the work I was doing with the department supporting them on building regulations, I provided some assistance to the policy team responsible for the fire safety order when it was first implemented. So it was a separate contract.
Now, on this project, I think it's right that you represented DCLG on the project group for the LGA guide.
I was one of the DCLG representatives, yes.
Why were you part of the project group, you particularly?
Well, I say there weren't really anybody else.
Right.
It would be me or no one, I think. From if you wanted someone from the department that could contribute to this, it would pretty much be me.
And what role did you take?
So I think, as I said in my statement, I think there was an initial discussion about the need for some better. I think it's quite difficult to remember the chronology, but it had been recognised, I think, by the policy team responsible for the order, that the fire safety order guidance, the way it had been structured, there was one guide which I think it was titled Sleeping Risks or something.
Sleeping guide.
Yeah, that's the one, Sleeping Risks. And the problem with that guide is that it covered hotels and blocks of flats in one guide, even though the strategies for those two types of buildings are very different. And that was causing problems in its application because they are just the design strategy is completely different. So it didn't work very well, and I think there were also issues that the fire safety order team had come across where there's I guess it's the legislative overlap between the fire safety order, which applied to certain parts of a block of flats, and the housing health and safety rating system, which is it works in a very different way, but essentially does the same job for the other parts of a block of flats. And I think it was a kind of discussions around that concluded that a guide that addressed all of the issues in one place would be the best way to resolve some of these kind of conflicts that were occurring with the different systems were all meeting in blocks of flats, and it was felt a guide that covered fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats would resolve that.
I'm going to cut across, and my question was, what was your role on the project group? What was your role on the project group?
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, so having decided that they needed a guide, I assisted my colleagues that were working with the fire safety order in securing a contractor. So I think I was one of the people that reviewed the various bids, and then subsequent to that, I was there really to review text and to contribute to the discussions about the development of the guide as it went along.
Were you also part of the reference group, or only the project group?
I can't remember. There were a number of different groups. I can't remember the exact constitution.
Now let's look at the guide itself. Can we please go to HOM 3045964? And the panel may be familiar with this document from careful examination of it last May, I think. And if we look, please, at page 120, we will look at sections 79.9 through to section 79.11. And in 79.9 it says this: in general needs blocks, it can equally be expected that a resident's physical and mental ability will vary. It is usually unrealistic to expect landlords and other responsible persons to plan for this or to have in place special arrangements, such as personal emergency evacuation plans. Such plans rely on the presence of staff or others available to assist the person to escape in a fire. And then 79.10, even in sheltered housing schemes, there will be reliance ultimately on rescue by the fire and rescue service in the event that residents cannot escape by themselves. However, in sheltered housing schemes, it's commonplace to hold information relating to any resident with particular mobility or other issues affecting their ability to escape. This can be made available to the fire and rescue service on arrival at the premises, for example, by keeping it in a premises information box, which can only be unlocked by the fire and rescue service at the main entrance. Details of any residents using oxygen or other medical gases are also usually kept with this information. And then 7911, it is not realistic to expect such an approach to be adopted where there are disabled people and others requiring assistance in a general needs block. Any attempts to keep information of this kind must be updated regularly, as inaccurate information could potentially be more harmful than no information. Now, can I take it that you're familiar with those paragraphs?
Reasonably so, yes.
Do you recall being part of any discussion about whether the responsible person's responsibility under the RRO extended at all to persons with mental or physical disability?
I remember it. So there's specific provision in the fire safety order where it requires the responsible person to consider. Is it persons at special? There's a particular phrase of language which I can't recall. The complexity with blocks of flats is whether it's never been entirely clear in my mind whether that applies to because the order is aimed only at the common parts of a block, is whether it's reasonable to expect the building. The person responsible for the building to be considering the occupants of the flats when they're in their flats. That's not as clear as it might be. One of the things that had been agreed in the drafting of this guide was to try and focus on what was considered to be best practice at the time for the building as a whole, without getting drawn into the boundaries between the different bits of legislation. Because the real question is what's the right way to manage a block of flats in terms of fire safety, not which bit of legislation starts and finishes where. That's a problem for the regulators, if you like, not for the person using it.
But can I just ask my question again, please?
Sorry.
Do you remember being part of any discussion about whether the responsible person's responsibility under the RRO extended at all to persons with a physical or mental disability? Do you remember being part of any discussion about that?
Not as specific as that. I remember discussions about people with disabilities.
Did you ever discuss or know of any discussions about the possibility of taking any legal advice about whether the RRO did extend to disabled people, or whether equality legislation might have a bearing on whether it did?
Not that I can't remember that in detail. I mean, that would have been something that the policy team for the fire safety order would have taken more direct.
Right. Do you know, or do you have any recollection of whether they did?
I think the generalities. I'd refer back to that. I'm sure the order makes specific reference to. It doesn't say disabled people, it says something else, but it's essentially implying that you need to consider them.
Can we take it to the best of your recollection, no such legal advice was ever obtained by government before the LGA guide went to press in August 2011?
I'm not confident in answering that question because that wouldn't have been... But to my knowledge, I have no recollection of that particular question being raised with lawyers.
Thank you. Now, given that the LGA guide, as we can see here, contained guidance about helping vulnerable and disabled persons in a fire, did you take any steps, or to your knowledge, did anybody take any steps to ensure that the authors of this guide obtained the views of organisations representing disabled people or vulnerable people?
I didn't know.
What about anybody else?
Again, I can't recall the exact constitution of the various groups, but there was a wide range of people involved in the production of this document. and I know that they certainly gave that a lot of consideration.
But to your knowledge, didn't do anything about it? Didn't actually ask people representing?
That doesn't mean to say they didn't, it means I don't know.
That's all I'm asking.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, I'd like to look at a letter that was sent by Elspeth Grant after publication in late August 2011 to Sir Merrick Cockle, who was chairman of the local government group. And this is after publication. Can we please go to HOM 3019844? And you can see it's dated the 23rd of August 2011, and it starts, "Dear Sir, fire safety and purpose-built blocks of flats. As a fire safety consultant who has worked with disabled people for many years, I'm writing to you as chairman of the local government group to request that the guidance titled Fire Safety and Purpose-Built Blocks of Flats is withdrawn and amended as the advice contained within is contrary to the law." Are you familiar with this letter?
I've seen it recently, yes.
Yes, but I think you saw it at the time, didn't you?
Yes, I would have done, yeah.
Yes, and I can show you the email string, just for our reference purposes. It's CLG 100049007, page 2. It was sent to you, I think, on the 29th of August 2011, to Colin Todd, copied to you. You remember that?
Vaguely.
Yes, I mean, I can show it to you if you like, but take it from me that you did get it at the time.
Okay.
I've read you the first paragraph, and then we go, please, to page 4, under conclusion. And what she says there is this: if this guidance is not amended, building managers and landlords who follow this advice will continue to discriminate in the area of fire safety against disabled people who represent 1/5 of the population, and indeed will be open to criminal or civil prosecution. Given the current approach to disabled evacuation and lack of enforcement in this area, it is a little surprise that the Fire and Rescue Service Equality and Diversity Strategy states, quotes, "The impact of fire is grossly disproportionate on some communities. For example, 39% of fatal fire deaths are people with disabilities," close quotes. I hope that this letter has explained the issues, and I look forward to your response before this guidance leads to an unnecessary tragedy because plans were not in force. Now, do you remember reading that part of the letter?
I must have done. I don't remember the experience of reading it at the time.
So you don't remember what your reaction was when you read it?
No, I don't think I do remember. I have an opinion about it, but what I remember, I'm not sure I can separate from that.
Right. Now, in his evidence to the inquiry, Colin Todd told us that this letter was brought to the project group for discussion, and there was representation on that group from the department, DCLG, and the CFOA. That's day 168, page 124, lines 5 to 12, for those who want to look at it. Do you remember being part of that meeting?
I don't, but it wouldn't surprise me if I was there.
Do you remember discussing the letter from Elspeth Grant?
Again, I can't confidently say I was there, but it wouldn't surprise me if we discussed it.
Right. Do you remember how you or the project group envisaged that vulnerable and disabled persons in a general needs block would be assisted or evacuated in the event of a fire?
There's a real problem with blocks of flats about how you deal with this question, and to some extent, the stay put approach helps considerably in that for the vast majority of incidents, the people in the flats will not need to evacuate, and those people that are in the flat where there is a fire are probably the only people that need to evacuate, and they should, if they're not able to traverse a staircase, then they ought to be able to get to the nearest protected stair enclosure, so get to somewhere reasonably safe away from the fire.
Unassisted?
Yes, I mean I think that is the challenge. Is there is no one else to assist them.
So Right, and that was a problem known to you and those in the group at the time, was it?
It's a universally understood problem, in that what could you reasonably expect somebody to do if you've got a person with disabilities in a flat on their own and they become involved in a fire. If the fire and rescue service can't get to them, there is no one else. You might get a benevolent neighbour, but you can't put that into a statutory procedure to say you must rescue your neighbour in the event of a fire. I think there are some people that think that should be the provision. That wasn't the prevailing view at the time.
So what do you do? What was the view at the time about what would happen to vulnerable persons with mental or physical disabilities?
Where possible, they would self-evacuate, or hopefully the fire brigade would get to them in time.
Well, what if it wasn't possible?
This is a very difficult subject to talk about objectively, but that's one of the reasons why there are a large number of people with disabilities that die in fires, is because they can't get themselves away from an incident. A lot of those fire deaths, when you look at the statistics, sorry, this is a very dark subject, are directly involved in the fire, so it's unlikely anyone could rescue them.
Well, it's unlikely that anyone could rescue them if you don't have a policy directed towards them.
Well, you could have a policy, but what would you do with it? I think it's. You can only expect of the responsible person something that is reasonable, and if you want to get to the point where a person who is unable to self-evacuate to be rescued in every event, then every block of flats would need a permanent staff of fire rescue people, which is unreasonable and impracticable.
Why?
It'd be too expensive. It'd be disproportionate.
Too expensive.
Too expensive, yes. I guess is the ultimate conclusion to that.
So people die in their flats because they're bedbound, because it's too expensive to have a system to get them out.
I suppose so. I mean,
was that British government policy?
That was what was considered at the time to be the prevailing, the reasonable approach to the problem. I don't think anyone had ever expressed it in those terms. I don't have much choice because you're asking me these questions in those terms. But that is the challenge with that. The only other option you could have would be to forcibly remove people from their homes and put them into care. And I think that would be an equally challenging policy position. So it's an area for which there is no perfect answer.
Well, leave aside perfect answers. The question is, did you or anybody else consider or discuss considering obtaining views from disability specialists or other stakeholders who represented disabled persons, at least just to find out what they thought?
This wasn't a new subject. This is something that had been discussed in the past.
What's the answer to did you or didn't you? I mean,
I honestly can't remember who discussed what with who, but the prevailing view that's set out in the LGA guide was what the consensus as being the reasonable approach to the problem. It's not perfect because a perfect answer is not available.
No, but there's a legally compliant answer, isn't there? As I think you'd be bound to accept.
I'm not sure that there, in terms of actually ensuring that they can always be rescued. No.
Had you heard of the Equality Act 2010?
Yes.
Right. To your knowledge, did anybody in the department, you included, consider seeking legal advice on whether Elspeth Grant was right in what she was saying as a matter of law?
I don't think anyone did.
Why is that?
Because the prevailing view was that the the reasonable approach that was set out in the LGA guide was what was the consensus of the fire safety community as being the only reasonable approach you could take at the time.
Well, I'm so sorry to be critical, but that sounds like a rather circular answer. The prevailing view was, of course, what is set out in the guide.
Yes.
After the guide was published, you've got the threat of a legal challenge, and I've asked you whether anybody considered taking legal advice on whether she was right as a matter of law.
So it's very common for people to write to the government or other public authorities claiming that something is not in compliance with the law. If policy officials referred that to lawyers every time that happened, we'd need a lot more lawyers.
And we can't be having that, can we?
I'm not sure I should comment on my view of lawyers. But
well, I'm not asking you about that. What I'm really asking you is, given that she's raised what... Well, let me ask it differently. Did you or anybody else who saw this letter take it seriously?
We would have taken it seriously, but the question is, what can you do? I'm trying to place in time what I know. This particular correspondent had some very strong views which were contrary to what was the consensus amongst fire safety professionals at the time. So the question is do you revisit all of that because of the opinions of one person, given that it had been given a lot of consideration and a practical option isn't really available? Alternative to the approach that we're taking isn't really available.
So is the answer to my question, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'm just trying to interpret what you've just told us, but is the answer to my question, no, that you didn't seek legal advice on the legal question raised by Elspeth Grant because there was already a consensus among safety professionals about what was reasonable?
Yes, I don't think we would have referred this for legal advice unless we thought the threat of legal challenge was real, which I don't think we did.
So you'd already made up your minds as a consensus and weren't willing to revisit it in the face of this letter?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, you can't revisit things like that every time somebody writes a letter.
Now, I haven't shown you the whole of the letter, but it runs to some 4 pages, and it cites, not just from the LGA guide, but from the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons, the RRO, and the Sleeping Guide, and arrives at a conclusion with some quite, I mean, one could disagree or agree about this, but with some analysis in it, as well as the Disability Discrimination Act 1995. When you saw this letter, did you just think it was a nuisance letter to be put on one side? Or did you think the author has done quite a lot of work here, has cited things that look as if they should be taken seriously? We need to find out whether there's anything in it.
I think I looked at it, from what I can recall, I think I looked at it and saw that these were issues that had been debated before. There was nothing new there. These were issues that people had discussed in the past.
All right. Now tell me then, if they discussed it in the past, let's take it in stages. When, in the context of 79.9 to 79.11, had there been any discussion about any of the Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons, the 1995 Disability Act, the RRO, or the Equality Act 2010?
I can't place particular dates, but I'd say the general debate is one that had been discussed regularly over the years. It's a real challenge. Fire safety for disabled people is a challenge in all buildings, and trying to get the balance between providing accessibility to all and how you address that in terms of fire safety is a very difficult problem. And the solution of the convention of personal emergency evacuation plans revolved around the fact that buildings had staff that could facilitate them. When you get to a block of flats, you don't have staff, and so the approach that had been taken in this country was to say that the stay put approach was the best way to resolve the challenges associated with disabled people.
Can we look at CLG 100004907, please? Now, this is an email chain from the following month, September 2011. If we look at page 1, second email down, 8th of September 2011 at 3:39, we have an email from Stephen Dawes at CS Todd and Associates to Caroline Bosdet and copied to Louise Upton and you, among others. You see that?
Yes.
Thank you. And he says, please find attached the basis of a response to this person's letter. You may feel it's a bit on the long side, but you know what we're like. Do you remember looking at the document attached to this email?
Vaguely, I can't remember the incident in detail, but I can remember seeing it, yes.
No, fine. Let's look at it. It's at CLG 100004906. And it's quite long, and it runs over 3 pages, but do you remember looking at this document in draft at the time?
Vaguely.
Yes. In the second paragraph, he says in draft, we've given careful consideration to the points you've made, including seeking clarification from the original drafting team, as well as the project group responsible for managing the development and publication of the guide. We hope that the following response will provide you with the explanation behind the recommendations given in the guide and reassure you that the particular needs of disabled and vulnerable people have been taken into account. And if we look at the next paragraph, which is the third one on the page, it says, the process involved in producing the guide involved extensive public consultation, which was widely publicised. In addition, we have held several roadshows to canvass views on what should be included in the guide and on some of the proposed content. And in the next paragraph, while we did not receive your comments at this stage, there was considerable feedback on the issue of fire safety, on the issue of safety of disabled and vulnerable people living in flats within a purpose-built block, and the extent to which the guide should and can address this. Now, we're just pausing there. Did you know whether the authors of the LGA guide had actually sought advice or the views of disability specialists or those representing disabled persons in the consultation?
I didn't know for sure, no.
You didn't know one way or the other?
I guess not.
Right. Then if we look at the bottom of page 2, in the second last paragraph, it says, you will appreciate that in the vast majority of blocks of flats, no one is employed to be present to provide any form of assistance to residents in the normal use of the building, let alone in emergencies. We therefore can see little value in preparing PEEPs when no one is available to implement them. We are sympathetic to the suggestion, which you and others have made, about holding information on vulnerable and disabled people that can be accessed by the Fire and Rescue Service. While we are aware of organisations that have put this in place, we do not consider it reasonable and practical to recommend that this is adopted by way of a default in all blocks of flats. It would place a significant burden on those managing blocks of flats to continuously update the information. Indeed, we have emphasised that inaccurate information might be more harmful than no information. Did you agree with that view, the view expressed in that last paragraph?
I knew that there was certainly a lot of involvement from the Fire and Rescue Service in the preparation of this, and there's no organisation that's got better experience of applying this, dealing with this problem in practice, and they were quite supportive of the guide.
What research or views had you sought to substantiate the view set out here?
I didn't do any, but I know that
No, when I say you, you're right, you're quite right. Let me rephrase the question. Do you know what research or views Colin Todd's office had done, or your department had done, to substantiate this view?
As it sets out in this letter, they went through quite an extensive exercise of talking to people with a stake in the issue of fire safety in blocks of flats, and they took this very seriously. And they also had a lot of experience themselves. CS Todd Associates do a lot of. I've got a lot of clients that with this type of building, so had a lot of experience of the practicalities of this. And I know that they discussed the issue with, as I say, all the various people at the different sort of meetings that they'd held around the country. And certainly the Fire and Rescue Service were heavily involved in all of that. And I think so that, which is why I think what they arrived at in their guide is what the majority of people working in fire safety considered to be a reasonable approach.
The majority of people working in fire safety, but not the majority of people on the receiving end of fire safety, residents, for example.
I suppose that's a possibly. I mean, there may have been some charities responsible for residents. I'm not sure. I can't say that with certainty. The difficulty is that people that are on the receiving end of fire safety often don't hold a lot of opinions on the subject. But I think they went as far as you would reasonably expect anyone would go in terms of trying to canvass opinions on the work they were doing.
Can we go back to the email run, please, at CLG 100004907 and go to the top of page 1. This is a response from you to Stephen Dawes, again copied to Louise Upton. Hi, Stephen. Para 12 is mixing a period of fire resistance with real time. A fire within a flat should, in the initial stages of the fire, stay within the confines of the flat for anything up to a period of 60 minutes. In the vast majority of cases, fires will be contained in a flat until they burn out. You might wish to use a different form of words to avoid a counter-argument that 60 minutes isn't long enough for disabled people. Why did you think that C.S. Todd wished to avoid a counter-argument rather than addressing Elspeth Grant's concerns?
I think I've agreed with the general thrust of the letter, but I've picked up on a technical error. I was just trying to help them with the drafting of the letter at that point.
Did it occur to you that if, in fact, 60 minutes wasn't enough for disabled people to escape, then it wasn't safe to leave disabled people unattended in their flats during the first hour of a fire?
You're committing the same mistake that they did in this letter, which is to mix periods of fire resistance with real time.
Well, why not instead look at it the other way around and examine the principle behind and the technical issues underlying the assertion that PEEPs were not required in general needs blocks?
Well, I mean, ultimately that would have been a policy question for the fire safety order team. But that would have been a strange thing to conclude, given all the work that had just been done, and the consensus was that it wasn't the best approach for dealing with blocks of flats.
Can we then go to HOM 3020345, email at the top of page 2 of that email run. This is the response sent by Elspeth Grant to Caroline Bosdet on the 17th of October 2011 after her reply. And she says this, Dear Caroline, thank you for your considered and detailed response to my letter of the 23rd of September. However, I note that your wide range of consultations do not mention, either in your letter or the document, any consultation with national organisations representing disabled people. This I would have expected to be essential, given that proportionally more of this group suffer fatalities in a fire and are likely to have a greater interest in this radical departure from all previous government guidance on the regulatory reform fire safety order, FSO. And she continues in paragraphs 2 and 3 to ask for a copy of the equality analysis undertaken and asks for details of those who provided the legal advice. That's the gist of those two paragraphs. And although she calls it an equality analysis, EA, we can, I think, presume that she meant an equality impact assessment. And if we go back to HOM, if we go back to page 1 here, please, at the foot of the page, we can see a response, or rather an email from Caroline Bosdet to you and Colin Todd and others, where she says, hello, I'm not really prepared to enter into further correspondence on this. Do you have any comments? Kind regards, Caroline. And then you say, in the email immediately above that, on the 17th of October, about 20 minutes later, whatever you do, keep your answer short. I assume no EA was produced. It isn't a radical change, it's just setting out what is recognised current practice, hence no need for an EA. Don't answer the legal advice bit. Now, just taking it in stages, why did you advise her to keep her answer short?
It looked like the potential for a long run of non-constructive correspondence. It's clear that the correspondent had a view which was different to what was the consensus and the way the guidance had been written, and was unlikely to be convinced otherwise.
Why did you assume that no EA, equality analysis, had been produced?
Probably for the reasons that's in the sentence immediately below that one, because it wasn't a radical change of guidance. That's what was recognised current practice.
Were you qualified to form that view?
I think based on the conversations we'd had, yes.
Did you obtain any legal advice to substantiate that view?
No.
Why not?
Because I didn't think I needed any.
Why did you advise that the question on legal advice go unanswered?
Because she would probably then subsequently ask for a copy of the legal advice, and again, it would just extend a debate which isn't particularly constructive. At that time, the likelihood of the guide being withdrawn and being modified to require personal emergency evacuation plans, particularly where that required that all residents would have a plan in place that meant that they could evacuate the building without the assistance of the fire and rescue service, as it wasn't going to happen. So there seems little point in continuing. It's a debate that's been going on for many years, and clearly continues now. There wouldn't have been any value in an extensive exchange of correspondence.
Can we go to HOM 3020571? Page 2 at the foot, please. Email from Caroline Bosdet to Elspeth Grant, 2nd of November 2011. And if we turn the page to page 3, we can see that the rest of it and the main email. And she says in the third paragraph to Elspeth Grant, it's practical guidance created by the housing sector and enforcing authorities, both the Fire and Rescue Service and Environmental Health. It's not statutory, it is not considered to be a radical departure from previous guidance, but sets out recognised current practice. And if we look at the second page of this email run, there's an email in response from Elspeth Grant of the 4th of November to Caroline Bosdet. And also to Louise Upton. Sorry, that's not it. Yes, the one at 9:40 on the 4th of November. Dear Caroline, thank you for your email. Government fire statistics show that 77% of all fatal fires involve disabled people, quite probably as a result of outdated current practice which does not meet the requirements of equality or fire safety law, British standards or any other government guidance on the subject. As you state in your email that your guidance is not a radical departure from previous guidance, please can you let me know which piece of fire safety law or government guidance you're referring to which supports the statements made in Clause 79. Now, you weren't copied into these emails, in fairness to you, Mr. Martin, but in the email above on page 2, we can see that Caroline Bosdet copies or forwards the email chain to you, Louise Upton, Colin Todd and Stephen Dawes. You see that?
Yes.
And she says, hello, I've had some further communication from this person. She was starting to ask for someone else. And then she goes on, we stated that this was the conclusion of our communication on the subject, but she's now dropped EIAs and is coming back with this. I'm starting to feel harassed by her, and she's also chasing up replies. I don't really have the capacity now to deal with her continuing questions. How do you want to play this? Colin, would you want to reply to her direct? Let me know what you all think. Kind regards, Caroline. And then at the very foot of page 1, and the top of page 2, you see you respond on the 7th of November to Caroline Bosdet, and over the top of page 2 you say this: I'd give her a reply along the lines of, we're happy with the guide, recognised as industry best practice, there's no point in arguing about it, I'm not going to reply to any further correspondence, then ignore anything else you get from her. Now, do you remember sending that email?
I don't, but I accept that I sent it.
What was the basis for your view that in relation to vulnerable and disabled residents, the guide was recognised as industry best practice?
Because of the work that the authors had done in canvassing views of all the people involved.
Right. And it may have been current practice, as Bosdet says in her email, but why best practice?
I think you're splitting hairs with words. I'm not sure I gave it that much consideration. That's what was regarded as the appropriate way of managing that kind of block.
Was it appropriate to recommend that correspondence from Elspeth Grant now be ignored rather than investigated with her concerns addressed?
Managing this kind of correspondence is a thing that people in public organisations have to do all the time.
Right.
You can't commit that much time to an argument which is clearly not going to go anywhere.
By this point,
I'm sorry, that sounds disrespectful, but it's a thing you have to do when you're receiving lots of correspondence. You need to recognise where there's somewhere you can help, or where there is an argument which is just going to perpetuate, and this is one of those.
Mr. Chairman, 2 more questions on this, and then I'm finished
right.
with the topic, if I may. But by this point, was it not absolutely clear to you that this was a legal question as much as a question of practice?
She was using the law in her argument, but the practical question is the one is key to me. I think I'm pretty sure. I can't remember the policy team for the fire safety order would have reviewed the guide with the department's lawyers, and this wouldn't be something you'd want to refer back to lawyers unless you thought there was a real legal issue here. I think this particular correspondent had some very strong views about this subject, which the majority of practitioners thought were impracticable in practice.
What led you to think that there wasn't a real legal issue here?
If there was a real legal issue, she could have taken it to a judicial review, and then it would have been reviewed in respect of the law. Ultimately, as policy officials, we can't determine the law one way or another. And as I say, it's not unusual for people to make references to various legal rights and so on. Again, if you dealt with all of those with that kind of attention, then you'd quickly run out of time to do anything.
Was the truth?
Oh, the third question, Mr. Miller.
Well, yes. Was the truth, Mr. Martin? You were all, you, Bosdet, Todd and Upton, fed up with Ms. Grant's persistence and just wanted to close her down. That's what it looks like.
I mean, that's part of it. Yes, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. A correspondent that's writing to you in a way which is not constructive and isn't going to result in anything, it is, I guess, something that you want to bring to an end. That doesn't mean to say that we didn't care about the issue. I think, in particular, Colin Todd, in particular, is somebody I know has spent a lot of time and effort trying to improve standards for means of escape and fire safety for disabled people. He's done a lot of work in that area. But you've got to manage these things, and the arguments she was putting forward. It's well understood that a large number of the people that become casualties in fires are affected by disability in some way. It's an incredibly difficult thing to try and solve.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient?
Yes, Mr. Willett, thank you very much. Well, it's time we close for the day, Mr. Martin.
Yes, sir.
So we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And as before, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone when you're out of the room.
Yes, sir.
All right? Thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher? Thank you. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.